Hello, my name's Paul. I record music as Nervous Test Pilot, and I'm here today to answer some interview questions from the lovely folks at Raw Fury about my Night in Tight Spaces soundtrack. So, without further ado, here is question one. Who is Nervous Test Pilot? Tell us a bit about you and your past and current works. So I've been recording music since I was about 15, 16 really, which is a very long time ago. Started off doing kind of weird, experimental, I guess you'd call it, electronic music. And then after university, I got involved with indie dev with my company Mode 7. And a lot of that work was me doing sound and music. So I did music for all of our games. Probably the best known thing I worked on was Frozen Synapse in 2011, which is a soundtrack that people still sort of bring up to me today. And I've been lucky enough to kind of have a group of people who followed me since that time. So that's been fantastic. And then subsequently, I've worked on a whole load of different projects. Recently, The Banished Vault from Bithell Games, and various other things, and of course Fights in Tight Spaces, which we'll come on to talk about in a minute. Game music has been something that I've always wanted to do, and I'm very lucky that I get to work on projects occasionally. It allows me to kind of use the full breadth of my experience, bringing some stuff in from dance music, which is something I did years ago as well, and the more soundtracky stuff, the more experimental stuff. It's a place where you can really be free to try lots of different styles, and that's something I really value. So question two, which is directly relevant, is how was the process from using the FITS Foundation to build an electronic medieval soundtrack for kits? How did you approach this new setting? And this was really, the trickiest thing about kits was trying to find a kind of style that felt authentic to the aesthetic of this new game, but still kind of evoked the Fights in Tight Spaces stuff. So I really started from the idea that I wanted to do something that was still kind of quite beat driven and quite sort of rooted in action music, which was always the case with FITS. Like a lot of FITS was about sort of late 80s and 90s action films, but with a twist of using some sort of modern sounds, some sounds from bass music and some other kind of more gnarly electronic sounds in there. And then translating that to kind of FITS' sort of punched up fantasy medieval setting was interesting. One thing that I experimented with a lot was using production techniques from drum and bass. So I listen to a lot of drum and bass. I'm particularly a fan of acts like Noisia, and I was able to kind of look at how they were producing things, particularly Nick Roos from Noisia, and how he thinks about drums and shaping acoustic drums kind of into the right configuration to still sort of punch through a mix and deliver that very loud and impactful sound. And I can't pretend that I'm anywhere near as good as people in that field. There's some incredibly talented producers in that scene. But what I wanted to do was just sort of borrow some of those ideas and then blend that with a very bombastic, sort of fantasy-influenced orchestral score. So getting those two things to sit together was the challenge, and I think having kind of a core challenge for every project you work on is good. Whether I succeeded on every track or not, I'm still not sure. I think there are some things that maybe lean a little bit too electronic, but overall, I'm happy with what I managed to achieve in terms of getting melodic themes in, which is something that's always very important to me, using orchestral instruments and having them sit against those more fantastical electronic parts. I wanted the electronic sounds to be like the kind of magic in the setting, something that extends beyond the very material sort of physical nature of those orchestral influences. So up to you to judge how successful that was, I think. Next question. Did you use any other medieval music, not only from games, but also from movies or other media as an inspiration? And the answer to this one is, unusually for me, it was quite rooted in games and sort of fantasy music from games. So Tsukasa Saito's Elden Ring score definitely had some influence, as it had on a lot of people. Also, one of my favorite composers is Motoi Sakuraba, who did Dark Souls, but also a huge load of other things going back to Golden Sun. Really recommend, if you sort of are into that style of music, that you go and look up Sakuraba and his work, because he blends a lot of kind of interesting jazz things in there with the orchestral stuff, and some of it's quite sort of impressionistic, and there's Western music and Japanese music in there, and he has this very cool kind of melting pot of things. That wasn't particularly a sort of direct influence in terms of was I taking melodic structures or that kind of thing from that music. It was more sort of the fact that you can blend a kind of sensibility of classical stuff with like a rock chord sequence, or some pop influence even in there, and sort of have that be valid. I'm not a super duper highly trained classical composer. I did have piano lessons when I was younger, but I've never kind of stuck to that traditional path. I've always been more interested in kind of sound design and sort of various other things. So that's sort of taken me, in some other directions. So yeah, nothing specifically from the kind of medieval range, but definitely some game fantasy music in there. Did you use any actual medieval instruments for the soundtrack? I did, but only in sampled form, unfortunately. I would love at some point to do something with, real players kind of recording instruments and Knights in Tight Spaces too. Hopefully we'll get the chance to do that. But there's a guy called Eduardo Tarilonte who does a lot of sample libraries that have medieval instruments in them. So one that I particularly like was Dark Era, which has an amazing UI. If you go and look up Dark Era, if you're a composer, you might know about this. But that has all kinds of things in it, like harps. There's a lot of harps in the soundtrack. Various flutes, including a bone flute that I think you can hear in the Skeletons track, and some other things like that. Frame drums. There's lots of percussion. I wanted lots of different percussion sources, so a lot of those were from those packs. Spitfire I use a lot, and there are some other kind of orchestral samples, I think is the name of the company that do a lot of that other stuff. So big orchestral percussion, as I've mentioned, lots of orchestral instruments from various companies, and some specifically medieval stuff. I think something I found with the medieval sound is just kind of it has that like tootling flute quality to it, and sort of somewhat out of tune sounding strings, and that can work in certain contexts, especially for sort of more pared down like tavern RPG type music, but this was mostly about those bigger, more bombastic sounds which you need a kind of fuller orchestra to do. So not a super duper authentic score, but I don't think that kind of would have worked with the vibe of the game anyway. Finally, give us some hints of Nervous Test Pilot as a kits player. What are your favorite classes, etc.? I am really not the person to ask about this. I am not much of a kits player. I think one of the things that I really enjoyed, playing the demo of kits, particularly coming from Fitz, is just the ability to have ranged weapons in there, and to have kind of, Overwatchy sort of action responses on ranged weapons is really cool. So you can kind of set up your spread tactically around the level, and then watch as your system you've created kind of comes into play when you do a move or an enemy attacks. So yeah, that is my impression of kits so far. I'm enjoying the party-based gameplay, particularly as a kind of evolution from Fitz. Well, thanks again for listening to me rambling. That is the end of the questions. And yeah, Kits has been a fantastic project for me to work on. It really pushed me in some new directions. I felt like I developed a bit of a new style for this. So it's something that I'd really love to work on again at some point. Thanks very much.